An arrogant TSA officer crossed the line, tearing a passenger's dress as a cruel joke. He laughed, until he found out her husband was the man who signed his paychecks. What happened next left everyone speechless. The airport was buzzing with travelers, each lost in their own world of departures and arrivals. Among them was Ava Carter, a poised black woman in her mid-30s, exuding quiet elegance. She moved through the security line with practiced ease, her designer dress, a stunning deep emerald gown that hugged her figure perfectly, drawing subtle glances from a few passengers. But Ava wasn't here to show off. She was just another traveler, making her way home after a week-long business trip. The TSA checkpoint was a chaotic orchestra of beeping machines and hurried conversations. Officers barked orders, directing people to remove their shoes, belts, and electronics. Ava did as instructed, her expression calm, unaffected. But just as she was about to step through the metal detector, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Ma'am, step aside. Random security check." Ava turned, her gaze meeting that of Officer Brad Whitman, a tall, burly man with a smirk playing on his lips. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his posture lazy, but there was something deliberate in his tone, something that made Ava's stomach tighten. She glanced around. Other passengers were moving through without issue. No other random checks were being called. She knew exactly what this was. Still, she nodded, stepping into the designated screening area. Another officer, an older black woman named Marjorie, observed from a distance. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes as she took in Ava's presence. Perhaps she recognized the exquisite fabric of the dress, or maybe she had seen Ava's face somewhere before. But whatever crossed her mind, she kept it to herself. Whitman took his time, dragging out the process unnecessarily. He instructed Ava to raise her arms higher, then to turn slowly. The scanner beeped, but nothing alarming. Still, he hummed, pretending to scrutinize the monitor. "Let's check again, just to be sure," he said too loudly, ensuring that passengers nearby were watching. Ava clenched her jaw. She had flown enough times to recognize when an officer was abusing his power. Then came the moment that made the entire airport stop. With a smirk, Whitman reached for the hem of her dress and gave it a sharp tug, a move that seemed careless, but was anything but. The delicate seam ripped instantly, the expensive fabric giving way under his grip. A loud gasp rippled through the surrounding passengers as the once elegant gown split down one side, exposing far more than Ava had ever intended in the middle of a crowded airport. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, a few muffled chuckles. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, did he just—" A couple of passengers looked away uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't seen a thing. Whitman grinned, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Guess that fabric wasn't as sturdy as it looked." Ava didn't move, didn't blink. She stood there, exposed, humiliated, violated in a way that no amount of wealth or status could have protected her from in that moment. Her hands clenched at her sides, but her face remained eerily calm. Too calm. Marjorie, watching from her post, shifted uncomfortably. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, warn someone. But before she could react, Ava slowly lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Whitman. There was no anger in her expression, no outburst, no demand for justice, just a quiet, unsettling stare, one that made Whitman's smirk falter, just slightly. And somewhere, deep in the airport's high-security offices, Ava's husband was about to receive a very important phone call. The seconds stretched long in the wake of the humiliating tear. The hushed murmurs around the checkpoint grew louder, some filled with discomfort, others laced with amusement. A few passengers glanced at each other, debating whether to intervene, but no one moved. Ava didn't flinch. She stood there, her breathing controlled, the rip in her dress exposing far more than she'd ever allow in any other setting. But she refused to let them see her falter. Whitman, emboldened by the lack of immediate consequences, crossed his arms and chuckled, shaking his head as if she were some ridiculous spectacle. "No hard feelings, lady. Just doing my job. Just doing his job." The words echoed in the air like a slap. Ava exhaled slowly, then reached for her carry-on, pulling out a silk scarf. With measured precision, she wrapped it around herself, covering the torn fabric with the grace of a woman who had been through worse and come out untouchable. She met Whitman's gaze, unshaken. "You might want to rethink that." His smirk returned. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Before she could answer, another TSA officer, a younger man, clearly uneasy, stepped forward. Officer Reynolds had been working under Whitman for months and had seen him pull stunts like this before. But this felt different. "Hey, Brad, maybe we should—" Whitman waved him off, eyes still locked on Ava. "Relax, rookie. She'll be fine." But Ava wasn't looking at him anymore. She was reaching into her bag, pulling out her phone, her fingers moving with chilling ease as she dialed a single number. She pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, it's me." Her voice was quiet, almost bored. "There's been an incident at security." A pause. "Yes, Terminal C, right at the checkpoint." Whitman laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, come on, lady. Who are you calling? Your lawyer? Your husband?" He exaggerated a fake gasp. "Oh, wait, let me guess. You're married to some hotshot who thinks he can—" A chime interrupted him. Every single screen in the terminal, every departure board, every monitor above the security lines, flickered, then turned blue. A few passengers gasped, looking around in confusion. The TSA agents near the checkpoint exchanged glances, clearly unnerved. The monitors, previously displaying flight schedules and boarding updates, now only showed one line of text. "Security protocol override in effect. All checkpoints, stand by." Whitman's grin vanished. Ava finally lowered her phone, calmly slipping it back into her purse. She adjusted the scarf around her shoulders and turned her gaze back to Whitman. "That was my husband." The color drained from his face. Passengers were whispering now, some pulling out their phones to take pictures. The air shifted, thick with the weight of something no one quite understood yet. A voice crackled through Whitman's radio, a voice far too authoritative to ignore. "All TSA officers at Terminal C, hold your positions. Supervisor en route. Immediate compliance required." Reynolds took an instinctive step back, his face tightening with unease. "Brad, what did you do?" But Whitman couldn't answer. Because at that moment, through the terminal doors leading to the private security offices, a man in a tailored Navy suit stepped into view. The CEO of the airport, and more importantly, Ava Carter's husband. Whitman's chest rose and fell unevenly. The laughter, the arrogance, it was all gone now. Because in that moment, he finally realized who he had just humiliated. And worse, what was about to happen to him. The airport felt different now. The usual hum of chatter, the endless footsteps, the calls for final boarding, it all seemed to quiet under an invisible pressure. He was here. Elias Carter moved with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. His presence alone shifted the air. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a flawlessly tailored Navy suit, he walked through the terminal like a man who owned everything he set foot on. Because in this case, he did. Passengers parted instinctively, stepping aside without even realizing why. TSA officers stiffened, recognizing him immediately. The CEO of the airport, the man whose signature was on every paycheck they received. And yet, Brad Whitman still hadn't moved. He stood frozen at the checkpoint, his mind scrambling for an explanation, for a way to rewrite what had just happened. But there was no undoing this. Ava Carter was his wife, and Elias Carter had just walked in, his dark eyes fixed solely on him. Ava remained poised, untouched by the chaos she had just set in motion. She adjusted her silk scarf with a grace that only made the contrast sharper, her elegance against Whitman's unraveling composure. Elias reached her in seconds. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. Instead, he let his gaze trail over her, noting the way her dress had been ripped apart, how she had covered herself without breaking a sweat. His jaw tightened. Then, in one simple motion, he removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, his movements slow, deliberate. A gesture that felt heavier than any outburst ever could. Only then did he turn to Whitman. Explain. One word. Sharp. Cold. Whitman swallowed hard. Sir, Elias's head tilted slightly, and Whitman stopped immediately. There was no use. No point in fumbling for excuses. Not when every single passenger had seen what happened. Not when his own colleagues had witnessed it. Not when his victim had just made a single phone call and shut down an entire terminal. The silence stretched unbearably. Then Elias spoke again, his voice dangerously smooth. Did you think humiliating my wife was funny? Whitman's mouth opened, then closed. Ava, standing beside her husband, finally broke her own silence. He said it was just part of his job, she murmured, tilting her head, as if genuinely considering the words. That ruining a passenger's clothing, violating their personal space, was standard TSA protocol. Elias's expression didn't change, but the energy around him did. Every officer in the vicinity held their breath. The regional TSA director, a wiry man in his 60s, who had clearly just sprinted here, arrived on the scene. His forehead glistened with sweat, his panic palpable. Mr. Carter, I can assure you, this is not in line with our training, and... Elias held up a single finger, and the man went silent immediately. I don't care about your training, Elias said. I care about what happened here today, in my airport, under your leadership. The director's face paled. Whitman was still rooted in place, but the weight of the moment was crushing him now. His smirk was long gone, his bravado, his false confidence, obliterated. Elias took one step closer. You like taking things from people? His voice was lower now, laced with something far more dangerous than anger. You enjoy making people feel small? Whitman shook his head quickly, his skin glistening with nervous sweat. No, sir, because that's over now. Elias's voice cut through him like a blade. You're done. Whitman blinked rapidly, panic flooding his face. Wait, please, Mr. Carter, You thought she was powerless? Elias didn't raise his voice, but somehow it was louder than anything else in the room. You thought you could do whatever you wanted, and there would be no consequences. Ava watched, silent, unmoving. You were wrong. The words landed like a final blow. And then, Elias turned slightly, to the regional TSA director, to the supervisors standing nearby, to the cameras that were undoubtedly recording everything now. You will personally ensure that this man is fired immediately. His record will reflect the truth of his actions, and he will never work security again. Not in this airport, not in any airport. The director nodded frantically. Yes. Of course, Mr. Carter. Whitman staggered back, his world crumbling around him. Wait, you can't. Elias raised an eyebrow. I can. And that was it. No shouting, no theatrics, just absolute unquestionable authority. Whitman stood there, his face blank with shock. He had humiliated Ava Carter for fun. But now, in front of an entire terminal, before passengers who had watched it all unfold, before his own colleagues who refused to meet his eyes, he was the one being stripped of everything. Whitman stood motionless, his face a mix of disbelief and sheer terror. Just minutes ago, he had been the one in control, reveling in the power trip of humiliating a passenger he assumed was beneath him. Now, he was standing in his own personal nightmare, and there was no escape. Passengers were still watching, their expressions shifting from discomfort to satisfaction. Some even recorded on their phones, capturing every second of the downfall that was unfolding before them. Ava, still draped in her husband's suit jacket, remained eerily calm. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't angry, she simply watched, like an observer to something inevitable. Because that's what this was, inevitable. A security team had already arrived, waiting for Elias's command. The regional TSA director stepped forward, clearly sweating through his shirt. His voice shook when he spoke. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, we will handle this." Elias didn't even look at him. His eyes remained on Whitman, who was now visibly shaking. "You think I'm done?" Elias finally said, his voice smooth, controlled. Whitman blinked. Sir, please, I didn't mean to what?" Elias's tone was so controlled, so measured, that it felt even more dangerous than if he had been shouting. "Didn't mean to tear my wife's dress? Didn't mean to humiliate her? Didn't mean to assume she was just another woman you could abuse without consequence?" Whitman opened his mouth, but no words came out. Elias finally turned slightly, to the TSA director, to the airport executives who had now gathered in stunned silence. His next words were final, unquestionable. "This man is not only fired immediately, but I want him blacklisted from every security-related job in the country. I will personally ensure that any employer who considers hiring him knows exactly what he did here today." The director nodded furiously, his hands clutching his clipboard like it was a lifeline. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." Whitman's face drained of all color. "Wait, please." His voice cracked. The arrogance, the smirk, the cruel amusement, all gone. Now, there was only desperation. "You can't. This is my job, my career, my—" Elias took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sheer power behind that movement alone made Whitman stumble back. "Your career?" Elias repeated, his voice almost mocking in its softness. "You threw away your career the moment you decided my wife was an easy target. That was your choice. And now, this." He gestured around them, at the silent crowd, at the cameras capturing every moment, at the mess Whitman had created for himself. "This is the consequence." Whitman's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He looked around wildly, as if searching for someone, anyone, to step in and save him. But there was no one left on his side. The younger TSA officer, Reynolds, stood in the background, watching silently, his face unreadable. The older female officer, Marjorie, let out a small sigh, not of sympathy, but of knowing, like she had seen this coming from the moment Whitman opened his mouth. Security moved in. 2 officers gripped Whitman's arms, their hold firm but professional. "You can't do this." Whitman's voice cracked, panic setting in. "I'll file a complaint. And who do you think will listen?" Ava's voice, smooth as silk, cut through the air like a blade. Whitman snapped his head toward her, but the look in her eyes made him flinch back. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't smug. She was simply watching him drown in his own undoing. Elias turned to the security team. His final order was absolute. Get him out of my airport. And just like that, Brad Whitman was removed from the very place he had once controlled. Passengers parted as he was escorted through the terminal, no longer the one giving commands, but the one being dragged away. The same people who had once watched in silence now whispered in satisfaction, their phones still recording, ensuring that his downfall would be seen far beyond the walls of this airport. Elias didn't watch him go. He turned back to Ava, his expression softening. Without a word, he reached out, gently adjusting the lapel of his suit jacket around her shoulders. "Are you all right?" he murmured. Ava exhaled slowly. She had won, but more importantly, she had never needed to fight in the first place. Her husband had taken care of that for her. The echoes of Brad Whitman's downfall still lingered in the air. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and awe. The TSA agents who had once stood idly by now seemed uneasy, shifting on their feet, avoiding Elias Carter's piercing gaze. They knew things were about to change. The regional TSA director wiped his brow, his panic still evident. He turned to Elias, forcing a smile that did little to mask his fear. "Mr. Carter, we sincerely apologize for this horrible misunderstanding. I assure you, we will implement immediate changes to ensure this never happens again." Elias lifted a hand, cutting him off without a word. The director froze, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. Ava, still wrapped in Elias's suit jacket, remained poised. She could have spoken, could have demanded more, could have dragged this moment out just to watch them all squirm. But she didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any demand she could have made. Elias, however, wasn't done. His voice was calm, but each word carried weight. "Your apologies mean nothing if your system allows men like him to thrive," he said. "Fix it, or I'll fix it for you." The director nodded so fast it almost looked painful. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." Ava exhaled slowly, then glanced at her husband. She reached up, adjusting the lapel of his jacket that still hung over her shoulders. "Are we done here?" she asked, her voice smooth, unaffected. Elias studied her for a moment, then offered her a small, knowing smile. "Yes," he murmured. "We're done." And just like that, he placed a gentle hand on the small of her back, guiding her away from the scene, not because she needed his protection, but because she deserved to leave with dignity. As they walked through the terminal, whispers followed them, some with admiration, some with curiosity, and somewhere, behind them, the remnants of Brad Whitman's career were still settling into the dust. As Ava and Elias walked through the terminal, the weight of what had just happened slowly faded behind them. She felt the shift in the air, how people looked at her differently now, not with pity, not with judgment, but with respect. Elias's hand remained lightly on her back, a silent promise that she was safe, valued, untouchable. Before stepping onto the private concourse, Ava paused. She turned slightly, just enough to glance back at the checkpoint where it all began. Brad Whitman was gone now. The terminal screens had returned to normal. The world kept moving forward. She smiled, not because she had won, but because she had never needed to prove anything in the first place. Elias leaned in slightly, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "What are you thinking?" Ava hummed, considering her answer. Then, with a quiet smirk, she adjusted the jacket around her shoulders and simply said, "I think we should buy another airport." Elias chuckled, shaking his head as they walked away. Some people think power is about control, that it's about who can humiliate who can take more, who can make others feel small. But real power? It's knowing who you are, knowing what you stand for, and never letting anyone strip that away from you. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their authority only to get exactly what they deserved in the end? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. And hey, if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There's plenty more where that came from.